Isabella Croft's world was one of polished surfaces and silent, immediate obedience. Her office, occupying the entire top floor of the Croft Holdings Tower, was a testament to this philosophy. Glass walls offered a panoramic, almost contemptuous, view of the city below, a sprawling circuit board she felt she could reprogram at will. The air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and the only art was a single, massive abstract painting in shades of charcoal and blood red, a piece she had acquired not for its beauty but for its brutalist statement on market disruption. She sat behind a desk of volcanic basalt, a slab so large and dark it seemed to absorb the light. Across from her, a senior vice president, a man named Sterling who had been with the company for a decade, shifted his weight from one expensive leather shoe to the other. His discomfort was a tangible presence in the sterile air. "The logistics are a minor drain, certainly," Sterling said, his voice carefully modulated to convey information without a hint of complaint. "Storage fees, insurance, the opportunity cost of the square footage. It's a rounding error, Isabella, but it's an untidy 1 inch." Isabella did not look up from the tablet in her hand. She was swiping through quarterly reports, her crimson-lacquered thumbnail a flicking blade of judgment. "Untidy is unacceptable. The portfolio we acquired from Kennington Motors was 99% intellectual property and real estate. The 1% is their physical detritus. I want it gone. All of it." "Of course," Sterling agreed instantly. "The liquidation plan for the machinery and fleet vehicles is already in motion. The issue is the R&D scrap. Building 7 at the old proving grounds. It's filled with what the acquisition team logged as miscellaneous composite molds, non-functional engine blocks, and one static display chassis." He paused. "It's essentially a garage full of garbage." Isabella finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held the same cold promise. "Then treat it as such. Put the lot up for a scrap auction. $1 starting bid. The winner is responsible for site clearance within 48 hours. I don't want to hear another word about it after this meeting. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Sterling said, relieved. He had expected a more complicated solution. He did not yet understand that for Isabella Croft, complications were things to be bulldozed, not navigated. Her attention had already moved on. She tapped a name on her tablet, summoning another file. "Marcus," she said, not to Sterling, but to the air. From a discreet desk in the corner of the vast room, a young man in a perfectly tailored but less ostentatious suit rose and approached. Marcus Thorne was her assistant, a role that required the precognitive instincts of a psychic and the emotional resilience of a bomb disposal technician. "Yes, Isabella," he said. "That meeting with the Zurich Consortium. Cancel it. Send them a gift basket with a note about unforeseen market volatility. They're fishing for a lower valuation, and I will not be nibbled at. And get Sterling the authorization he needs to write off the Kennington scrap. I want it off the books by end of day tomorrow." She dismissed them both with a subtle wave of her hand, her gaze already returning to the glowing screen, her world contracting once more to the clean, predictable certainty of numbers on a page. Marcus retreated to his desk, a flicker of unease in his eyes as he processed the casual demolition of a month's worth of negotiations. He understood her efficiency, but he sometimes wondered if she could distinguish between cutting a line item and cutting a throat. Section. Elias Vance's world was one of worn surfaces and quiet, deliberate motion. His domain was a 2-car garage behind a modest bungalow in a neighborhood of neatly kept lawns and aging oak trees. The garage was not a place of chaos, it was a sanctuary of order. Tools hung not on pegboards but in custom-made foam cutouts within shadow boxes, each wrench and caliper resting in its own perfect silhouette. The concrete floor was sealed and spotless, free of the oil stains and grime that plagued lesser workshops. The air smelled of clean lubricant, ozone from the TIG welder, and the faint, pleasant aroma of sawdust from a woodworking project on a side bench. He stood before his main workbench, the light from a Luxo lamp illuminating the intricate viscera of an antique German clock. Its brass gears and delicate escapement were laid out on a lint-free cloth with the precision of surgical instruments. His daughter, Lily, sat on a high stool beside him, her small legs swinging. She was 8 years old, with her father's serious eyes and a quiet watchfulness that made her seem older. She wasn't chattering or demanding attention, she was observing, her chin propped on her hand, as Elias used a pair of fine-tipped tweezers to seat a minuscule jewel pivot. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with metal, yet they moved with the grace of a concert pianist. He exuded a stillness, a deep well of patience that seemed to emanate from him and settle over the entire garage. He breathed slowly, his focus absolute. He nudged the jewel into place, checked it with a jeweler's loupe, and then gave a small, satisfied nod. "There," he said, his voice soft. It was the first word either of them had spoken in nearly an hour. "Now the palette fork will move without friction. It will keep perfect time again." Lily leaned closer, her dark hair falling over her shoulder. "Because everything has its right place," she recited, a phrase she had heard him use 1,000 times. Elias smiled, a rare and gentle thing that softened the lines of concentration around his eyes. "Exactly. Everything has its right place." He began the painstaking process of reassembling the clock's movement, his actions unhurried and sure. This was his life now. Small, precise, meaningful repairs. Fixing things that were broken, restoring order to small corners of the world. It was a quiet existence, built deliberately on the foundations of a much louder past, a past he rarely spoke of but which lived in the muscle memory of his hands and the quiet confidence of his gaze. He was a single father, a widower, and in the meticulous order of his workshop, he had found a peace that the world of ambition and accolades had never offered him. Section. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, the fluorescent lights of the garage were replaced by the warm glow of a single incandescent bulb above his workbench. The clock, now fully assembled and ticking with a gentle, rhythmic heartbeat, sat on a shelf. The quiet was broken by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A moment later, Ben Carter walked in, carrying a cardboard box of takeout containers. Ben was Elias's oldest friend, a man whose rumpled suit and perpetually worried expression belied a sharp legal mind and an unshakable loyalty. "I come bearing pad thai," Ben announced, setting the box down on a clear patch of bench. "Figured you'd forget to eat again." Elias wiped his hands on a clean rag. "I was going to." "I know," Ben said, pulling up a stool. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and the scrape of forks. It was Ben who finally spoke. "I saw something today. A liquidation notice. Croft Holdings is dumping the last of the Kennington assets." Elias paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. The name Kennington was a key to a locked room in his past. Kennington Motors had not been a giant. It had been a small, fiercely independent British firm that, for a brief, glorious decade, had produced some of the most innovative and daring sports cars in the world. Elias had been their chief systems engineer. "I thought they'd stripped it bare years ago," Elias said, his voice neutral. "Almost," Ben confirmed. "This is the last piece. The contents of an old R&D storage facility at the Ashworth Proving Grounds. The notice calls it scrap material and a display chassis. They're selling it as a single lot." "As is, where is?" Elias put his fork down. A different kind of energy now animated his stillness. It was not excitement, but a deep, focused curiosity. He had spent the best years of his professional life in that facility. He knew what scrap at Kennington meant. It meant failed experiments, yes, but it also meant the parts that were too advanced, too expensive, or too radical for production. It meant the bones of brilliant ideas. "Display chassis," Elias repeated softly. He stood up and walked to a large steel cabinet in the corner. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He opened it on the workbench. It was filled with schematics, hand-drawn design sketches, and complex engineering diagrams. Ben came over and looked. The drawings showed a car of breathtaking, aggressive beauty. It had lines that were both futuristic and classic. "Project Valkyrie," Ben read from a notation in the corner of a drawing. "We only ever built one," Elias said, his finger tracing the sweep of a fender. "The board got cold feet. Said the materials science was too far ahead of its time, the supply chain too unstable. The acquisition happened before we could prove them wrong. The official record says the prototype was dismantled." "But you don't think it was," Ben stated, knowing his friend. "We didn't dismantle it," Elias said. "We hid it. We reclassified the chassis as a static design study for accounting purposes. A fiberglass mock-up. The engine and drivetrain components were logged as failed test parts and crated up. We put it all in Building 7, hoping that one day, one day we might get the chance to finish it. His voice was laced with a long-dormant ache of professional loss. His wife, Elena, had designed the carbon composite monocoque. Her initials were on the bottom of the schematic. The project had been their shared dream. Her death in a highway accident a year later had shattered more than just his heart, it had shattered his ambition. He had walked away from it all to raise their daughter, turning his back on the high-stakes world of automotive engineering for the quiet solitude of his garage. Elias, Ben said, his voice serious. The auction is tomorrow morning. This Croft woman who runs the holding company, she has a reputation for being a shark, but a lazy one. She buys big, strips assets, and dumps the rest. She won't look closely at a pile of what her people have told her is junk. Elias closed the portfolio. He looked at his hands, then around the quiet, orderly garage. He looked at the ticking clock on the shelf, a symbol of the life he had built. For years, that life had been enough. But the mention of Kennington, of Building 7, of Valkyrie, had stirred something within him. It was not about money or fame. It was about finishing something. It was about honoring a memory and proving that real value, the kind born of genius and dedication, could not simply be written off as a rounding error on a balance sheet. "What's the minimum bid?" he asked. Section. The Ashworth Proving Grounds were a bleak, windswept expanse of cracked asphalt and faded concrete bunkers. Building 7 was a featureless corrugated steel structure at the far end of the facility, looking forgotten and forlorn. A small group of scrap metal dealers had gathered for the auction, their trucks idling nearby, their expressions bored. They were here for bulk aluminum and steel, not for esoteric automotive history. Elias arrived in his old, meticulously maintained Ford pickup. He wore his usual uniform, flannel shirt, clean work jeans, and sturdy boots. He looked like a man who might be interested in a few £100 of scrap copper, nothing more. He signed the waiver and entered the cavernous, dusty building. And there it was. In the center of the floor, under a thick layer of dust, sat a shape covered by a gray tarp. It was low, wide, and impossibly sleek even under the shroud. Surrounding it were dozens of large wooden crates, stenciled with old Kennington inventory numbers. The other dealers barely glanced at the car, focusing instead on piles of discarded aluminum extrusions and old machinery in the corners. Isabella Croft arrived in a black Audi sedan that purred to a stop outside, its engine a quiet whisper. She stepped out, dressed in a sharply tailored wool coat and sunglasses, looking utterly out of place and entirely in command. Marcus Thorne followed, carrying a leather folio. She had decided to oversee this minor transaction personally, not out of necessity, but as a symbolic gesture of closing the Kennington chapter. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere. The auctioneer, a man hired by her firm, became nervous and obsequious. Elias ignored her. He walked slowly around the tarp-covered shape. He didn't touch it. He simply looked, his eyes taking in the dimensions, the wheelbase, the specific way the tarp settled over the cockpit. He knew the form beneath it as well as he knew his own reflection. Then he turned his attention to the crates. He examined the stenciled numbers, his expression unreadable. To anyone else, they were random alphanumeric codes. To him, they were a table of contents. He saw the code for the transmission bell housing. The one for the inboard suspension assembly. The one for the ECU wiring harness. It was all here. Isabella watched him, a faint, amused smirk on her lips. She saw a simple laborer, a grease-stained mechanic, looking over her company's trash. "See anything you like?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Elias turned to face her. He met her gaze directly, without intimidation. "I might," he said. The auction began. The bidding for the scrap metal in the corners was sluggish. Elias didn't bid. Finally, the auctioneer gestured to the car and the crates. "And now, Lot 7B. One display chassis and associated manufacturing surplus. Sold as a single lot. Buyer responsible for full clearance of the building within 48 hours. We'll open the bidding at $1,000. Silence. The scrap dealers shook their heads. It was too much work. A car that didn't run and a mountain of mystery crates. 1,000, Elias said, his voice calm and clear. The auctioneer looked at Isabella, who gave a slight, impatient nod. "I have $1,000. Do I hear 1500? More silence. Isabella was getting bored. This was taking too long. She wanted to be back in her clean, orderly office. Let's wrap this up, she said to the auctioneer, her voice carrying across the cavernous space. She looked directly at Elias. He's the only bidder. It's his, then she added, a cruel little joke for her own amusement. I'll be genuinely impressed if you can even get that thing to make a noise in a year. Marcus, standing beside her, winced. He had seen the look in the quiet man's eyes. It was not the look of a simple scrap dealer. It was a look of profound knowledge. He leaned in and whispered to his boss. The joke in the acquisitions department was that it would be a miracle if someone could fix it in 24 hours. Isabella laughed, a short, sharp sound like breaking glass. Fine, she said loudly to Elias. Get it running in 24 hours and I'll buy you a cup of coffee. The scrap dealers snickered. The condescension was thick enough to taste. Elias showed no reaction. He simply walked to the folding table where Marcus sat with the paperwork. He produced a certified check from his wallet, already made out to Croft Holdings. Ben had prepared it that morning. Marcus took it, his fingers brushing Elias's. He felt the hard calluses and the surprising warmth of the man's hand. He looked up and met Elias's steady gaze. There was no anger there, no humiliation. There was only a quiet, unnerving certainty. Marcus felt a sudden, chilling premonition that his boss had just made a very, very expensive mistake. He stamped the bill of sale and handed it over. The transaction was complete. Section. The next 24 hours were a blur of coordinated, purposeful activity. Elias had used the advance from Ben not just for the purchase, but to lease a large, secure workshop on the industrial side of town. 2 heavy-duty flatbed trucks arrived at Building 7 before Isabella's Audi had even cleared the proving grounds gates. The car, still under its tarp, was loaded with surgical care. The crates were loaded by a forklift Elias operated with practiced ease. By nightfall, Building 7 was swept clean, and its contents were safely housed in the new workshop. Alone, under the bright, clean light of the new facility, Elias finally pulled back the tarp. The body of the Valkyrie was unpainted, a patchwork of raw carbon fiber and primer gray composites. It was not shiny or pretty. It was a weapon waiting to be armed. But the lines were perfect. The aerodynamic sculpting was years ahead of its time. It was exactly as he and Elena had designed it. He ran a hand gently over the roofline, a gesture of reunion. He spent the next hour opening the crates. His movements were methodical, a master craftsman taking inventory. Just as he had suspected, everything was there. The engine, a bespoke 60-liter V12 with an experimental hybrid electric recovery system, was nestled in a custom-built cradle. The unique transaxle, the carbon ceramic brakes, the pushrod suspension components, all were individually wrapped and preserved in cosmoline. The scrap was, in fact, one of the most advanced automotive engineering kits ever conceived. He made only 2 calls. The first was to a man named Gabriel, a fabricator whose skill with carbon fiber and titanium was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones in the racing world. Gabriel had been Kennington's lead chassis builder. The second call was to an older man named Miles, a reclusive genius who had designed the Valkyrie's entire electronic nervous system, from the ECU to the data logging suite. Both men had been unceremoniously laid off after the Croft acquisition. I have it, Gabe, Elias said into the phone. Valkyrie. It's all here. There was a pause on the other end, then a low whistle. You're kidding me. Building 7. Building 7, Elias confirmed. I'll be there in the morning, Gabriel said without a moment's hesitation. The call to Miles was just as brief, and the response just as immediate. They did not ask about pay. They did not ask about the plan. They asked only for the address. Their loyalty was not to a company, but to the work itself, and to the men who had always been its quiet, brilliant heart. When they arrived the next day, the workshop was already a hive of activity. Elias had mounted the engine on a stand and was beginning the process of meticulously cleaning and inspecting every component. An array of schematics was unrolled on a large table. Gabriel surveyed the scene, his eyes alight. Miles walked over to a crate labeled with a code he recognized and patted it like an old friend. She made a joke, Elias said, not looking up from his work. The woman who sold it to me said to get it running in 24 hours. Gabriel chuckled. An idiot's challenge. We'll need a week just to do the pre-assembly checks properly. I know, Elias said. We're not working to her timeline. We're working to ours. The days that followed were a montage of pure, focused craft. There was little talk, only the shared language of skilled work. The whir of pneumatic wrenches, the precise click of a feeler gauge, the soft hiss of cleaning solvents. Gabriel worked on preparing the chassis, inspecting every inch of the carbon monocoque for stress fractures or delamination from its long storage. Miles laid out the entire wiring harness on a massive board, testing every connection, every sensor, every line of code in the ECU. Elias was the center of it all, the quiet conductor. He rebuilt the engine with a surgeon's focus. He lapped the valves, measured the piston clearances to the 10,000th of an inch, and torqued every bolt to its exact specification, his movements economical and certain. Lily would often appear after school, brought by Ben. She would sit quietly in a corner, doing her homework, the sounds of the workshop a familiar lullaby. She would bring the 3 men bottles of water and sandwiches, a small, serious steward for their grand project. They encountered problems, as they always did. A rubber O-ring had perished. A specific mil-spec connector for the data logger was obsolete. A minor bracket had been misaligned in the original fabrication. There was no drama, no shouting. Each problem was met with quiet analysis, followed by an ingenious solution. Elias machined a new O-ring from a block of Vuitton. Miles repinned a new connector, his soldering work a miniature marvel of electronic art. Gabriel fabricated a new bracket from a sheet of titanium, TIG welding it with a bead so perfect it looked like a row of stacked coins. They were not just assembling a car, they were breathing life into it, their shared expertise the very breath. On the 10th day, the engine was lowered into the chassis. The drivetrain was connected. The wiring harness was painstakingly routed and plugged in. The moment was approaching. The prompt from the story's title was on their minds, but not as a deadline. It was a private joke. The arrogant woman had given them 24 hours. They had taken over 240 hours just to get to this point, a testament to their refusal to compromise. But now, the final phase began. Let's start the clock, Gabriel said with a thin smile. Final systems check and fluid load. Let's see how fast we can do it right. They began the final push. Fuel lines were purged and filled. The custom oil tank was filled with synthetic racing oil, 10 quarts of amber lifeblood. Coolant was bled through the system, chasing out every last air bubble. Miles sat in the bare cockpit, a laptop tethered to the ECU, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he ran a final diagnostic sequence. Every sensor, every injector, every ignition coil reported back, green. 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 Elias stood back, wiping his hands on a rag. He watched his 2 friends work, their movements a synchronized dance of competence. He felt a deep, profound satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the act of creation, of bringing order and function out of a scattered collection of dormant parts. 11 hours after they began the final assembly, it was time. The workshop fell silent. Miles gave a thumbs up from the cockpit. Gabriel stood by with a fire extinguisher, a standard precaution. Elias leaned into the cockpit and turned the key. There was a whir of the high-torque starter, a cough, and then the V12 engine erupted into a smooth, stable, and utterly ferocious idle. It was not the lumpy, brutish roar of a muscle car. It was a crisp, mechanically dense sound, a complex harmony of perfectly balanced components turning at incredible speed. It was the sound of precision. The sound of victory. They had not done it in 24 hours. They had done it right. And the final, critical phase had taken them 11 hours of flawless, concentrated effort. Section. Ben Carter had connections that ran in quiet, wealthy circles. He made one call to a man named Alastair Finch, a reclusive British billionaire who had made his fortune in software but whose passion was collecting cars of significant engineering provenance. He didn't collect them to display them, he collected them to appreciate their mechanical soul. Ben didn't send photos. He simply said 5 words into the phone, Elias Vance has the Valkyrie. 2 days later, a black helicopter descended onto a private airfield near the workshop. Alastair Finch was a small, bird-like man in a tweed jacket who looked more like a university professor than a titan of industry. He arrived at the workshop with a single engineer, a man who had worked for 3 different Formula One teams. Elias met them at the door. The Valkyrie sat in the middle of the floor, its unpainted body now polished to a dull sheen. It looked elemental, purposeful. Finch walked around it slowly, his eyes missing nothing. His engineer used a small ultrasonic scanner on the monocoque and looked at the readings with a raised eyebrow of appreciation. Finch peered into the engine bay, looked at the suspension geometry, and then at the perfect welds on the exhaust manifold. He turned to Elias. "I knew your work at Kennington," Finch said, his voice a quiet rasp. "I tried to hire you after they folded. You had disappeared." "I had a daughter to raise," Elias replied simply. Finch nodded, a gesture of complete understanding. "She is a more important project." He looked back at the car. "May I hear it run?" Elias started the engine. The sound filled the workshop, clean and powerful. Finch closed his eyes for a moment, listening. When he opened them, his decision was made. There was no haggling, no negotiation. He and Ben went to a small office Elias had set up. Finch's assistant made a call. A wire transfer was initiated. The number was not $740,000. It was $8.5 million. The sum was not just for the car, it was seed capital. Finch was not buying a car, he was investing in the genius that had created it, commissioning Elias's new company, Vance Precision, to maintain the Valkyrie and to consult on his entire collection. The car was loaded onto an enclosed transporter that evening. As it drove away, Elias, Gabriel, and Miles stood watching. They had the capital now to build their company on their own terms, to take on only the projects that mattered, to work without compromise. Their victory was quiet, private, and absolute. Section 2 months later, Isabella Croft was in a private lounge at the Geneva airport, flipping through a special edition magazine for the ultra-wealthy, a glossy publication focused on passion investments. An article caught her eye. It was titled, "The Resurrection of the Valkyrie." The story detailed the stunning, secret discovery and sale of the mythical Kennington prototype. It praised the genius of its original design team and the brilliance of the small, elite consultancy that had restored it. The sale price was mentioned in breathless tones, a new record for a prototype vehicle. And then she saw the name of the consultancy, Vance Precision. The founder was a man named Elias Vance, a reclusive former Kennington engineer. A photo accompanied the article. It was a black and white shot of a man in a simple flannel shirt, his hands resting on the carbon fiber flank of the car. He was looking at the camera with a calm, steady gaze. It was the man from the auction. The scrap dealer. Isabella felt a cold shock, a sensation so foreign she didn't immediately recognize it. It was the feeling of being utterly, catastrophically outmaneuvered. The condescending words she had spoken in that dusty building echoed in her ears. Get it running in 24 hours. The $1,000 check. The casual, arrogant dismissal. She closed the magazine, her knuckles white. The rage came next, a cold, silent inferno. It was not about the money, not really. She dealt in larger sums every day. It was about the principle. She, Isabella Croft, had been made a fool of. She had held a masterpiece in her hand and, through sheer, arrogant ignorance, had thrown it in the trash. And the men she had dismissed as a nobody had picked it up and revealed its true worth to the world. Back in her office, she summoned Marcus. Find out everything there is to know about Elias Vance and Vance Precision, she commanded, her voice dangerously low. Marcus, who had seen the same article that morning, had already done the work. He placed a thin file on her basalt desk. It contained Elias's professional history, his patents, his legendary reputation within the engineering community. It also contained a copy of the bill of sale for Lot 7B, signed by Isabella herself. The head of the Kennington acquisition team, Mr. Sterling, was the one who signed off on the initial asset valuation, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. He classified the chassis as a non-recoverable static asset, with a book value of 0. Isabella looked at the file, then at Marcus. She needed a sacrifice. Someone had to pay for her mistake. Sterling, the man who had brought the untidy problem to her in the first place, was the obvious target. Have security escort Sterling from the building. His network access is revoked, effective immediately. I want his office sanitized by noon. Marcus nodded, though he knew Sterling was only guilty of not possessing the esoteric knowledge of a world-class automotive engineer. The true failure in judgment had occurred in this very office. Driven by a burning need to reassert her dominance, Isabella instructed Marcus to arrange a meeting with Elias Vance. She would not be beaten. She would absorb him. She would buy his company, control his genius, and turn his victory into her own. The meeting took place at the Vance Precision Workshop. It was a different building now. With the capital from the Valkyrie sale, Elias had purchased the very industrial park where the workshop was located. The space was larger, brighter, and filled with state-of-the-art fabrication and diagnostic equipment. But the spirit was the same. It was clean, orderly, and humming with the sound of quiet, productive work. Isabella swept in, dressed in a severe black suit, an avatar of corporate power in a temple of tangible craft. Elias did not greet her at the door. He was standing at a workbench, meticulously polishing a newly machined suspension upright, his back to her. He did not turn around when she approached. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice crisp. "You've done well. You took a piece of scrap and made something of it. I admire that kind of initiative." Elias continued his work, the rhythmic motion of his hand on the polished metal the only sound for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, without turning. It was never scrap. The simple, undeniable truth of the statement momentarily wrong-footed her. She recovered quickly. "Be that as it may, you now have a boutique operation with a certain cachet. But boutique operations are fragile. Croft Holdings can offer you global reach. Resources. A real future. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer to acquire Vance Precision and bring you on as head of a new performance division." She was offering him a golden cage, a return to the world of boardrooms and balance sheets he had deliberately left behind. She thought she was offering him the world. She did not understand that he had already built his own. Elias stopped polishing. He placed the component down carefully on a soft cloth. He turned, finally, to look at her. His eyes were calm. There was no triumph in them, no anger, no satisfaction. He was simply looking at a person who did not, and could not, understand. "No," he said. The word was not aggressive. It was not defiant. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the anvil in the corner of the workshop. Isabella was stunned into silence. She had expected negotiation, posturing, a demand for more money. She had not expected a simple, absolute rejection. "I don't think you understand what I'm offering," she said, a dangerous edge to her voice. "I understand perfectly," Elias replied, his voice still quiet. "You're offering to buy something you can't value, so that you can own something you don't understand. I already have everything I need." He gestured to the workshop around him, to Gabriel fitting a panel on a new project, to Miles calibrating a sensor. "I have my work." Just then, the door to the office opened and Lily came out, carrying a drawing. She saw Isabella and stopped, regarding the strange, severe woman with a child's unfiltered curiosity. She walked to her father's side and held his hand. Elias looked down at his daughter, and the gentle smile returned to his face. He looked back at Isabella. "And I have my priorities." In that moment, Isabella Croft understood. She could not win. She could not buy him, she could not intimidate him, she could not control him. He operated in a currency she did not possess. His wealth was not in his bank account, it was in his skill, his integrity, and the quiet, unshakable love for his daughter. She had lost the moment she had looked at him in the dusty building and seen only a scrap dealer. She turned without another word and walked out of the workshop, her heels clicking sharply on the clean concrete floor. The sound was angry, impotent. It was the sound of a world of surface and status retreating in the face of something real and substantive. Section. The sign that eventually went up on the main building of the industrial park was a model of understatement. Brushed steel letters against dark gray brick, spelling out a single word, Vance. There was no motors or engineering or industries, the name alone was enough. It had become a hallmark of ultimate quality, a quiet legend in the automotive world. Vance Precision did not advertise. It did not have a marketing department. Clients came to them through word of mouth, seeking not just performance, but perfection. Elias remained unchanged by the success. He still wore flannel shirts to work. He still lived in the same modest bungalow. His greatest pleasure was still the quiet hours in the workshop, solving a complex mechanical problem or teaching Lily how to read a schematic. The money provided security and the freedom to choose his projects, but it did not define him. One afternoon, a year after the confrontation with Isabella, Elias was in the main workshop, watching Lily carefully use a digital caliper to measure a small aluminum spacer she was helping him make for one of her models. She wrote the number down on a notepad, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Is it right, Dad?" she asked, showing him the number. He checked it. "It's perfect, Lily." "Exactly right." He looked around the thriving workshop, at his friends engaged in work they loved, at the incredible machines taking shape around them, all born from a single act of arrogant dismissal. Isabella Croft was still out there, buying and selling companies, her name still a symbol of financial power. But she would forever carry the knowledge of her most profound failure, a quiet, nagging reminder of the one asset she had fundamentally misunderstood. She had judged a man by his clothes and a car by its coating of dust, and in doing so, had revealed a poverty of vision far greater than any financial loss. Elias Vance, meanwhile, had everything he had ever wanted. He had not sought revenge, he had simply pursued excellence. The downfall of his antagonist was not his victory. His victory was the quiet hum of the workshop, the respect of his peers, and the small, warm hand of his daughter held firmly in his own. He picked up a clean rag and wiped a smudge of grease from his workbench. Everything, he thought, was finally in its right place.